morning, Ms. Kraemer. Please make yourself comfortable. And when you are ready, you may begin with your opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present before you again. My name is Gretchen Kraemer. I'm currently the Division Director for the DHS Division of the Iowa Attorney General's Office. I've worked for the AG's office for 12 and a half years, and I've been in my current position for 3. Before that, I had the opportunity to work for Whitfield and Eddy here in town for 4 years as an associate, and before that, I clerked for the Honorable George Fagg. One thing I'd like to address right off the bat is the question of, do you need to be a district court judge before applying for the Court of Appeals? Obviously, I don't think so, or I would not have applied. It's a great honor and a great experience to be a district court judge, and I've not had that experience yet, but what I have done is appellate work, quite a bit of appellate work. I have 136 cases before the Court of Appeals, 6 before the Iowa Supreme Court, and 14 before federal appellate courts, most in the 8th Circuit and 1 in the 7th Circuit. I have about 10 more that are still pending decision and 3 on my desk waiting to be written. So I have done a lot of the work before the court that I am applying to be a part of. And I'm not just a Polk County lawyer. I've practiced throughout the state of Iowa. I've practiced, I haven't done the full Grassley yet, but in a number of jurisdictions. I've practiced both in state and federal court. I've had practice before the Department of Inspections and Appeals doing administrative law. And so I think that that breadth of experience would also be an attribute that would be a benefit for the position that I'm applying. I provided the commission with different writing samples this time that reflect a lot of the work that I do before for the Iowa Attorney General's Office. The first case is a pretty typical civil commitment case, a hospitalization, involuntary hospitalization for somebody who, because of their mental illness, is not able to make treatment decisions for themselves. The second case is a conditions of confinement case. I think I provided the motion for summary judgment, and that was one of the bigger cases I've had. It challenged that the treatment as a whole at the civil commitment unit for sexual offenders was inadequate. And so we were successful on summary judgment and did not have to go to trial on that case. Would have been a 3-week trial held at Cusco and Cherokee, so we were very happy that we didn't need to do that. A lot of the work I do does have the benefit of qualified immunity, and so a lot of those cases are resolved on summary judgment instead of going to trial. But I've had about 50 conditions of confinement cases. I also provided the panel published work, part of my dissertation research. I also have a PhD in clinical psychology in addition to being a lawyer, and my research was with the Federal Bureau of Investigation on serial homicide. And this particular project was looking at law enforcement data to provide an empirical basis that the FBI could then use in their investigations going forward. And at the time, it was the first national sample that was produced. So I'm proud of it, and I also provided it to the panel to show that I can do different kinds of analyses and different kinds of writing. I live in Johnston with my husband, John, who is also a public servant. He is the bureau chief for the Fire Service Training Bureau. We have 2 daughters, Meta, who is 12 today, it's her birthday, and Abby, who's 9. And right now we spend a lot of our time doing kid things and running our children to various activities. I think I would do a very good job at the Court of Appeals, and I would really appreciate the opportunity. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. And so we will begin with some questions, and we'll begin this time with Ms. Conover.
And no questions, thank you.
Mr. Bloom.
Well, we had a really interesting conversation. Appreciated that. We talked quite a bit about sort of the intersection of individual rights and the need for the state to control the damage that an individual can do to others, and the civil. And so, being sort of a libertarian, I was real interested in your observations and the role you play in managing the legal issues where citizens are claiming that the state of Iowa is violating their rights, even though they might be sexual predators or something like that. So it's a real interesting contrast. And it doesn't strike me from what I've read and seen from the many applicants for this that the law is completely clear, that it's an area where there's definitely some substantial judgment in how a law is meted out. So just to expand a little bit, you had come to this from sort of a unique perspective with your clinical psychology background and law background, and it struck me that you make a lot of judicial-like decisions in the job you have. Is that true or not true? How do you see it?
Well, I do think the job requires an exercise of judgment. The state has important powers and really significant powers over the lives of individuals, and it is for the greater good to the extent somebody is acting in a way that is dangerous because of their mental illness or their mental abnormality in the case of sexually violent predators. But it's also important that they be treated with respect and that they get the services that they are entitled to during their confinement. And so I think whenever you have an issue raised in these litigations, like every litigation raises the opportunity to learn something. So maybe everything was done correctly, but there's an opportunity to better explain it to the individual involved. Maybe everything was done correctly, but there's an opportunity to improve a practice or a procedure. And so I do think that the department and I try to look at that in all of the cases that we see, not only that the law is complied with, but that the individual is served, that the employees are safe, and that things are working in the best way that they can.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Spies.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Having appeared before Judge Bennett many times, I was heartened to see that you wrote a letter of recommendation on your behalf. Not to put too much pressure on you, know he's probably watching right now.
Thank goodness.
Is there an appellate judge or justice who you emulate or would like to emulate, whose characteristics as an appellate judge or justice you most think best suited for the Court of Appeals, and someone you would like to model after?
I definitely like a lot of the writing of the judges and the justices. Mary Tabor has done some really nice opinions on cases that I've submitted before her, where I feel like we had a conversation just like you and I are having, and I always like that when I feel like there's a good result in that regard. I like Justice Waterman's writings. I think they're very practical and pragmatic, and it speaks with a very clear voice. Obviously, Judge Bennett is quite the scholar, and his opinions are...
And exacting.
Yes, and as a lawyer, it was always of great benefit when you found a Judge Bennett opinion on the case that you had or an issue that you had, because all of the research was right there.
Thank you.
Mr. Hoytig.
It's been my experience that not every great trial lawyer is a great appellate lawyer, and not every great appellate lawyer is a great trial lawyer. Not every great district court judge transitions to be a good appellate court judge. Not every great appellate court judge would be a good district court judge. What comes to mind is Richard Posner was reversed as a district court judge after he retired, and he is quite prominent as a Court of Appeals judge. What do you think are the qualities that separate the trial court practice and the appellate practice, and can you speak to those in this position?
Sure. Well, I guess I'd like to start with the similarities. Obviously, you have to have a good command of the law and be smart to do both jobs. You have to be fair and impartial. I think the district court judge requires a little bit more of the management of humans than the appellate work. The appellate work has a broader view with the evolution of the law as a whole. There's definitely more research and writing. There's a different pace to that work. And I think that the eye toward the evolution of the law as a whole and not just resolving the case at bar is something that's more attuned to the appellate work.
Thank you.
Ms. O'Brien.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Sukup.
No questions.
Mr. Goodman.
I just finished a case against the DOT, and the issue was immunity. And I was struck by the fact that during the mediation, the statement was made, well, if these were private engineers, they'd be liable, but we're subject to the public duty doctrine. And my question is this: do you think there's room for change to the immunity doctrine? And in your representation of state agencies, have you ever represented someone who, in the end, was personally liable for a judgment?
So I think that's wide open right now under the Godfrey decision in the city of Esterville. There will be new law made in constitutional torts and new immunities that are strictly under the Iowa Constitution. And I think as a government lawyer, don't really know how that's going to shake out yet. I have some of those cases pending, and I think I have about 15 to 20 affirmative defenses trying to make sure that all of the avenues are covered as the law develops. I've not personally represented anybody who I thought was individually liable. Certainly we've had cases where we feel like there was an error made, and you do the best to fix it, and in most cases you can, or at least do something so that it doesn't happen in the future.
Thank you.
Ms. Law.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Gray.
I have no question.
Ms. Pearson.
No questions.
Ms. Stanger.
No questions.
Mr. Berger.
No questions.
Ms. Valentine.
Thank you. I'm curious if you could share with us your thoughts on the differences between private practice and working in the AG's office.
Sure. I don't miss billing in 6-minute increments. That's definitely a function of private practice. Private practice has the business element to it that you don't have at the Attorney General's office. But the Attorney General's office gives you the opportunity to look for ways, in the way the court does as well, to advance the law and to ensure that justice is being done. And I've appreciated that opportunity to try to make sure that the system works well for all of the citizens of Iowa who are served by it.
Thank you.
Mrs. Sinclair.
No questions.
Mr. Bevel.
Thank you. You mentioned practicing throughout the state.
Mm-hmm.
Is that significant, or how would that affect your ability to serve on the Court of Appeals?
I think it's important to remember that Des Moines is not the center of Iowa, that there are a lot of experiences that happen in other towns and in other jurisdictions that are important. I think context is important, and I sometimes, coming from a very rural town in Oregon, people who live in rural areas can feel like their voice is lost or maybe not heard, and so I do think that there needs to be attention paid to that to ensure that the relevant context of whatever decision that is before the court is heard.
Mr. Horbach.
I have no questions, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Kraemer, for being here today. We wish you well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.